beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, on a somewhat individualized basis, federal agencies ramped up their use of private standards, mainly because they were confronted with a new regulatory mandate in a universe where there was already a proliferation of very useful private standards. And so in a way, incorporation by reference is about integrating this huge world of private standards with government regulatory regimes. And it's worth noting here that the standard system is much, much bigger than the sphere of federal regulation. So figures that I was given by the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, which has a substantial role in coordinating the private U.S. standards system, was that there were about 600 standards development organizations. You can compare this to about 100, a little over 100 federal agencies, many of which actually are not regulatory agencies. And there are estimated to be, at least as of 5 years ago, about 100,000 active standards in use throughout the United States. So this world of standards is just huge. And a very small percentage of those standards are actually ever incorporated by reference into federal regulations. I did a case study of pipeline safety regulations and the use of standards and the costs of the standards in federal pipeline regulations. And there were three organizations that I think the figure was 73, they created 73% of the standards that were incorporated by reference in federal pipeline regulations. But those standards accounted for only a few percentage points of each standards development organization's standards. Based on this, my guesstimate is that maybe 2 to 4% of privately developed technical standards are actually incorporated by reference into federal regulations. And it tends to be some of the same standards over and over again, because there are certain standards that are privately developed and are the standard for that particular field. So, for example, the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code is what I like to refer to as the Mac Daddy of all voluntary consensus standards. It's ginormous, first of all. It's created by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, which is now an international standards organization. And the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code is multiple volumes, thousands of pages. It governs everything from the residential boiler that's in your basement at home and provides you with hot water, all the way up to nuclear reactors. And it makes sure that those things don't explode, which used to be a huge problem. And it's a problem that ASME's Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code basically solved. So when the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, for example, needs to use standards for boiler and pressure vessels, they use provisions from the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code. And it's not just because they're lazy and they don't want to create their own standard, or it would be really expensive for them to create their own standard, although that latter point is certainly the case. The reality is that the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code is the international standard for these kinds of technical problems. And so if the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration were unable to use that standard and had to create their own, they would be directly competing with a much more sort of well-established standard and creating real problems for their regulated industry, who use that standard for a variety of reasons aside from just compliance with federal regulations. So for an administrative agency, oftentimes they use a standard because it is already the standard. And the best way for them to communicate to their regulated industry how to comply with federal regulations in these technical respects is by using incorporation by reference to kind of integrate their federal regulatory regime with that existing and very powerful private standardization system that already exists.